In the peaceful town of Cedar Creek, nestled within the misty Appalachian foothills, life flowed quietly, like the morning fog. People trusted their routines and rarely noticed the details around them. But one April morning, a change occurred. A lone Canada lynx, thin and restless, began appearing near the storm drains behind the shops. It returned at dawn and dusk, pacing and watching with an unspoken desperation. While most saw it as a fleeting sight of nature's edge, Annie Caldwell, a lifelong local with a keen eye and a compassionate heart, sensed something more, something hidden in the lynx's movements. What was it searching for? Before we start, make sure to subscribe the channel and hit the like button. Also hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The early morning fog clung low over Cedar Creek, a small town tucked into the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in Virginia. Annie Caldwell pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down Main Street toward Guthrie's butcher shop, where she had worked for the past 15 years. At 58, Annie found comfort in routine, the same quiet walk to work each morning, the familiar nod to Mrs. Patterson as she watered her geraniums, and the warm scent of freshly ground coffee wafting from Harmon's Diner. But something about this April morning felt different. The town had been battered by spring storms for nearly 2 weeks, leaving the ground saturated and the creek swollen well beyond its banks. Cleanup crews were still working to clear fallen branches and repair downed power lines. Annie sidestepped a deep puddle, thankful that the rain had finally stopped 3 days earlier. As she rounded the corner near the old post office, something unusual caught her eye. A flash of tawny fur and a bobtail disappearing behind the dumpster at the edge of the municipal parking lot. She paused, squinting through the misty light. Wildlife sightings weren't rare in Cedar Creek, with a national forest just beyond the town limits. But it was uncommon to see a wild animal this close to such a busy part of town. Was that a Canada lynx? She murmured, cautiously stepping toward the dumpster. Peering around the edge, she caught sight of the animal, undeniably a Canada lynx, slipping along the chain-link fence that bordered the narrow drainage canal running behind the shops. Annie had always found Canada lynxes fascinating, elusive creatures that rarely showed themselves to humans. But this one seemed different. Even from a distance, Annie could tell it was thin, its normally muscular frame looking almost gaunt. The Canada lynx paused near a storm drain, lowering its head to peer intently through the metal grate before moving on. There was something desperate in the way it moved. A far cry from the confident, powerful predator Annie had occasionally glimpsed in the woods behind her home on the edge of town. Throughout her shift at the butcher shop, Annie's thoughts kept returning to the Canada lynx. When her boss, Frank Guthrie, noticed her distraction as she trimmed a rack of lamb, he raised a bushy eyebrow. "Something on your mind, Annie? You've been a million miles away all morning." Annie explained what she had seen, describing the Canada lynx's behavior and concerning appearance. Frank, a lifelong hunter and outdoorsman, nodded thoughtfully as he wiped his hands on his apron. "Probably a female," he said. "This time of year, they might have kittens. Makes them take risks they normally wouldn't. Hunger'll do that." When Annie's shift ended in the late afternoon, she found herself taking a detour past the municipal parking lot instead of heading straight home. To her surprise, the Canada lynx was back, this time crouched near the entrance to the same storm drain, pacing back and forth with obvious agitation. Annie kept her distance, watching from behind a parked car. The animal dropped to its belly and stretched one paw toward the drain opening, as if trying to reach something inside. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "Are there babies down there?" The Canada lynx's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and it turned to look at her. Its amber eyes reflected a mix of wariness and exhaustion that tugged at Annie's heart. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, woman and wild animal, connected by a quiet, unspoken understanding. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the Canada lynx vanished into the underbrush lining the drainage canal. Annie remained where she stood, her mind racing. If there were indeed kittens trapped in that drain, they wouldn't survive long without help. But she also knew better than to approach a storm drain alone, or to interfere with wildlife without proper expertise. The next morning, Annie arrived at work earlier than usual, her tote bag heavier than normal. Frank looked up from where he was grinding fresh sausage. "Frank," Annie began hesitantly, "I was wondering if I could have some of the beef trimmings and organ meat you usually throw out." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Taking up exotic cooking?" She explained her suspicions about the Canada lynx and the storm drain. I thought maybe if I left some food, I could at least help the mother survive while I figure out who to call about the kittens. To her relief, Frank didn't laugh or brush her off. Instead, he nodded and disappeared into the walk-in cooler, returning with a paper-wrapped package. "Liver, heart, and some beef scraps," he said. "If you're right about those kittens, their mama's gonna need all the help she can get." After her shift, Annie returned to the storm drain, the package of meat tucked in her bag. The area was quiet, no sign of the Canada lynx. Carefully, she placed several pieces of meat on a flat rock about 20 feet from the drain, then retreated to the safety of her car to watch. Nearly an hour passed before the Canada lynx emerged, slinking cautiously from the underbrush. It sniffed the air, wary but clearly drawn by the scent. Hunger eventually won out. The Canada lynx crept forward, snatched a large piece of liver in its jaws, and, to Annie's surprise, carried it straight to the storm drain. Instead of eating it, it dropped the meat through the grate, then returned for another piece, which it devoured quickly before carrying more back to the drain. "I knew it," Annie whispered, heart pounding. "Those poor babies." Over the next 3 days, Annie developed a routine. Each morning and evening, she left food for the Canada lynx, watching from a respectful distance as the animal divided the offerings between itself and whatever lay in the storm drain. The Canada lynx seemed to grow slightly less wary of Annie's presence, though it remained cautious. On the 4th morning, Annie decided it was time to see exactly what she was dealing with. She arrived early, before the town was fully awake. The Canada lynx was nowhere in sight, probably off hunting, she guessed. Summoning her courage, she approached the drain, knelt beside it, and peered through the metal grate. At first, she saw nothing in the darkness below. Then came a small movement, and a faint, pitiful mewling sound that clenched at her heart. As her eyes adjusted, she saw them. 5 tiny Canada lynx kittens huddled together in the concrete tunnel. Their spotted fur was matted and dirty, their eyes wide with fear. "Oh, you poor things," Annie breathed. They couldn't be more than a few weeks old, far too young to survive on their own. The storm drain was about 6 feet deep, with smooth concrete walls that offered no chance of escape. They must have fallen in during the recent flooding, washed away from their den when the drainage canals overflowed. A low growl behind her made Annie spin around. The mother Canada lynx stood about 15 feet away, a small bird clutched in her jaws, her posture tense and protective. "I'm not going to hurt them," Annie said gently, rising slowly and backing away from the drain. "But they need more help than you can give them, Mama." That evening, back home, Annie dove into research. She finally found the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, a local organization that specialized in rehabilitating native Virginia wildlife. When she explained the situation over the phone, the woman on the other end, who introduced herself as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the center's veterinarian, responded with immediate concern. "Canada lynx kittens in a storm drain?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "How long have they been there?" "At least 4 days," Annie replied. "Probably longer. I first noticed the mother earlier this week, but we had severe flooding before that." "That's very concerning," Dr. Rodriguez said. "If they've been trapped that long, they could be suffering from exposure, dehydration, and malnutrition, even with the mother trying to feed them. We need to get them out as soon as possible." The rescue was scheduled for the following morning. Annie arrived at the storm drain at dawn to find 2 vehicles already parked nearby. A van bearing the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center logo and a municipal works truck. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a petite woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, was discussing the safest way to remove the drain cover with a city worker. "You must be Annie," Dr. Rodriguez said warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you for calling us. Most people would have ignored this, or worse, called animal control to have the mother trapped as a nuisance." Annie shook her hand. "I couldn't just leave them. The poor mother has been doing everything she can to care for them. We'll need to be ready in case she returns during the rescue," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "Canada lynxes are fiercely protective of their young. My assistant Jake," she nodded toward a tall, bearded man unloading equipment from the van, "is a trained wildlife handler. He'll be ready with a catch pole and transport crate if we need to temporarily contain the mother." The city worker, a middle-aged man named Tom, whom Annie recognized from around town, used a specialized tool to lift the heavy grate. As it came free, the group cautiously gathered around the storm drain's opening. Jake shone a powerful flashlight into the tunnel below. The 5 kittens were huddled together in a relatively dry corner of the concrete pipe, blinking against the sudden brightness, their tiny faces a mix of fear and curiosity. "They're alive," Annie exclaimed with relief. Dr. Rodriguez nodded, her expression calm but her eyes soft with compassion. "Yes, and they don't look as bad as I feared. Their mother's done an incredible job keeping them alive." Jake prepared a long-handled net and a soft-sided carrier. "I'll try to get them all at once to reduce their stress," he explained to Annie. "The less time we spend here, the better, especially if the mother returns." As if summoned by the conversation, a low, warning growl came from the bushes near the drainage canal. The mother Canada lynx had returned, crouched low to the ground, ears flattened, eyes fixed on the humans near her kittens. "No sudden movements," Dr. Rodriguez said calmly. "Tom, Annie, step back a bit, give her some space." Annie and Tom moved several yards away as Dr. Rodriguez continued speaking in a soft, even tone, as though the Canada lynx might somehow understand. "We're helping your babies, Mama. Just a few more minutes." Jake worked quickly but with great care, scooping all 5 kittens in a single, smooth motion. Their panicked cries triggered an immediate response. The mother Canada lynx sprang forward a few paces before stopping, clearly torn between protecting her young and avoiding the humans. "Got them," Jake said, placing the kittens into the carrier. He stepped away from the drain slowly, deliberately. Dr. Rodriguez knelt beside the carrier and gave the kittens a quick assessment. 3 males, 2 females, about 4 weeks old, she reported. They're dehydrated and underweight, but alert and responsive. No visible injuries. The mother paced just beyond the clearing, growling in short bursts, her anxiety unmistakable. Annie felt her eyes fill with tears as she watched the desperate animal. She understood on a visceral level the fierce maternal instinct driving her. The drive to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center was a quiet one. Annie sat in the back of the van with the 5 Canada lynx kittens, keeping a watchful eye on them. Their tiny bodies, still so fragile, curled together in a huddle, their wide eyes reflecting a mixture of confusion and fear. Dr. Rodriguez and Jake were in the front, speaking in hushed tones about the best course of action for the kittens. The Wildlife Center was located in a quiet, wooded area just outside of town. It was a place that had become well known among locals for its successful rehabilitation programs and its dedication to preserving the wildlife of the Blue Ridge Mountains. As they pulled up, the staff was already waiting, ready to take the kittens inside and begin their assessments. "Let's get them inside, and I'll give them a full examination," Dr. Rodriguez said, as the van came to a stop. Annie followed her into the building, her heart still racing from the events of the morning. Inside, the clinic was a flurry of activity. Various enclosures held all kinds of animals, birds with broken wings, small mammals recovering from injuries, and reptiles being rehabilitated for release. The room was warm and smelled of clean bedding and medicine, a place where creatures of all kinds could find refuge. Annie helped Dr. Rodriguez and Jake transfer the kittens into a quiet recovery room, where they could be closely monitored. One by one, the tiny lynx were gently removed from their carrier and placed on a soft, padded surface. Their fur was matted from the dirt and moisture of the storm drain, and they looked even smaller than Annie had imagined, but they were alive, each one a testament to the strength of their mother's care. Dr. Rodriguez immediately began checking each kitten for signs of illness or injury. She checked their eyes, ears, and mouths, feeling gently along their tiny limbs to ensure there were no broken bones. "They're malnourished, but otherwise in good condition," she murmured, offering a reassuring smile to Annie. "The next few days will be crucial, though. They'll need to be fed every few hours, and we'll monitor them closely." Annie nodded, her heart heavy with concern but relieved to know they were in good hands. As the day wore on, the staff at the Wildlife Center worked tirelessly to stabilize the kittens, providing them with a special formula for wild felines. The kittens drank hungrily, their tiny bodies finally getting the nourishment they so desperately needed. Annie sat nearby, watching over them with a quiet sense of awe and responsibility. By late afternoon, Dr. Rodriguez called Annie over to the main office. "We're going to need to keep them here for a while," she explained, offering Annie a cup of tea. It's going to be a delicate balance, getting them strong enough to survive on their own while keeping them safe from any further trauma. I'd say at least a couple of weeks, maybe longer. I understand, Annie replied softly. But what about their mother? I feel like I've taken something from her by removing them. Dr. Rodriguez smiled gently. It's a valid concern. The mother will be anxious, and she may even try to come back for them. However, her first priority right now is survival. With the drainage system being so dangerous, it's unlikely she'll be able to retrieve them on her own. Annie frowned, knowing how hard it would be for the mother to let go. But she also knew that there was no way to return the kittens to the storm drain, not without putting them back in immediate danger. So, what happens now? We'll keep the kittens here for rehabilitation, Dr. Rodriguez said. In the meantime, we'll monitor the mother. If she continues to stay close, we may be able to work with local wildlife agencies to reunite them. But, in all honesty, it's a rare thing for this kind of rescue to lead to a successful reunion. Wild animals don't always accept their young after being separated for a long period. That evening, as Annie prepared to leave, she stood outside the clinic, gazing at the dense woods surrounding the facility. She had made a difference today. She knew that. The kittens were safe. But there was still a lingering sadness in her heart, a nagging feeling that she'd taken something important from the wild. It was 3 days later when the mother Canada lynx returned. Annie had been visiting the wildlife center each day, spending time with the kittens and watching them grow stronger with each feeding. Their tiny forms were starting to fill out, their fur beginning to gleam under the care of the staff. But she hadn't forgotten the mother, her wild eyes filled with concern for the fate of her babies. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the clinic, one of the staff members came running into the room where Annie was sitting with the kittens. "She's here," the staff member said breathlessly. "The mother's here." Annie's heart skipped a beat. She immediately stood, heading for the door. Outside, the mother Canada lynx was pacing near the edge of the woods, her eyes fixed on the wildlife center. She let out a low, throaty call, a sound full of both longing and desperation. It was a sound Annie had heard once before, deep in the woods, when she'd first discovered the kittens. "Stay here," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly, her voice filled with authority. "Let's see how she reacts first." They stood in silence, watching the mother. After several minutes of pacing, she stopped. She raised her head, sniffing the air, and then, as though making a decision, she began to walk toward the wildlife center. The staff members tensed, but Dr. Rodriguez held her ground. The mother came closer, her movements slow and deliberate, but there was no aggression, just an unmistakable sense of urgency. As she neared the enclosures, she paused, eyes locked on the building. She mewed once, softly. "She's calling them," Annie whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The night that followed the mother's arrival at the wildlife center was one of quiet tension. Annie couldn't sleep, her thoughts constantly drifting between the kittens in their care and the wild lynx mother outside. The way she had called for her young, so softly yet so urgently, had struck a chord deep within her. Annie knew that this moment would be crucial. Would the mother accept her kittens again, after their separation? Would she allow them to return to the wild, or would she refuse, unable to let go of the bond she had formed with them? The next morning, Annie was the first to arrive at the center. She parked her car, walking toward the clinic with a sense of determination and hope. As she approached the front door, one of the staff members came out to meet her. "Good morning," the staff member said, his tone calm but serious. "We've been monitoring the mother all night. She hasn't moved far from the fence. She's still here, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Annie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Waiting for her babies," the staff member replied. "She's been pacing and calling for them. It seems like she's trying to find a way inside. We think she's realizing they're close." Annie's heart raced, and she followed the staff member outside, her mind racing with a million questions. They made their way to the back of the clinic, where the large enclosures were located. The mother lynx stood just beyond the fence, watching the building with her keen eyes. "Will she be able to get through the fence?" Annie asked. "No, the enclosures are secure," the staff member reassured her. But we have to be careful. If we let her in too soon, she might spook the kittens. It's a delicate balance. The staff had devised a plan to allow the mother to approach without causing any harm to the kittens. They would bring the kittens out into a secure, open area nearby, where the mother could see them, but not touch them immediately. It would be a test of whether she recognized them, and whether she could accept their return into her care. Dr. Rodriguez arrived shortly after, and the team began setting up for the meeting. They moved the kittens into a small, enclosed area just beyond the main clinic building, giving the mother a clear view of them but ensuring there was still a barrier in place to prevent her from getting too close too soon. Annie stood at the edge of the yard, her eyes fixed on the mother lynx, who was now pacing just outside the fence, her eyes never leaving the kittens. Her tail twitched with nervous energy, and her ears were pinned back as she watched every movement of the tiny furballs. "Do you think she'll accept them?" Annie asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Rodriguez sighed, looking at the mother with a thoughtful expression. "There's no way to know for sure. Wild animals, especially mothers, can be unpredictable. The bond between them is strong, but the longer they've been apart, the harder it can be for them to reconnect." They all waited in silence, watching the mother for any sign of recognition. The kittens, for their part, were still too young to fully understand what was happening. They were mewing softly, their tiny heads bobbing as they tried to explore their new surroundings. Their eyes widened when they saw the mother, and one of them let out a tentative, high-pitched cry. The response was immediate. The mother froze, her head snapping toward the sound of her kitten's voice. Her eyes widened, and she stepped closer to the fence, her body tense with anticipation. The kittens continued to call, their cries more insistent now, and the mother responded with a series of soft, melodic mews. For a few moments, nothing else mattered. It was as though the world stood still, and all that existed were the sounds of the wild, the calls of the lynx, and the connection between mother and child. Annie felt her breath catch in her throat as the mother took a step forward, her body slowly inching closer to the enclosure. The staff members stood back, allowing the mother to approach at her own pace. "Do you think she'll try to climb the fence?" Annie asked, her voice barely audible. "It's possible," Dr. Rodriguez answered, "but we'll have to trust her instincts. If she feels the need to be with her kittens, she'll find a way to get to them." The tension in the air was palpable as they all waited, watching with bated breath. The kittens were still chirping and mewing, and slowly, the mother began to move toward them, her body low to the ground, her movements fluid and graceful. She came closer and closer, and just when it seemed like she might leap over the fence to reunite with her babies, she stopped. She was only a few feet away now, close enough to reach out and touch the kittens through the fence, but she remained still, her eyes soft and filled with recognition. The kittens stopped calling, now quiet, as they turned to face her. The mother let out one last low mew, her tail twitching in a way that suggested a mixture of relief and sadness. She stared at her kittens for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to make the final move. Finally, the mother took a step back. She looked toward the forest, then back at her babies one last time. With a heavy heart, she turned and began to retreat back into the woods. Annie's heart sank, and she felt a lump form in her throat. Had the reunion failed? Had the mother decided her babies were no longer hers? But then, to Annie's surprise, the mother stopped a few paces into the woods. She looked back once more at the enclosure, her eyes lingering on her kittens. And, in that moment, Annie understood. The mother was leaving, not because she didn't want to be with her kittens, but because she knew they were safe now. They were in capable hands, and it was time for her to return to the wild. As the mother disappeared into the trees, Annie allowed herself to exhale, her heart both heavy and full. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the Wildlife Center was a mixture of relief and reflection. The reunion had been delicate, emotional, and, in the end, bittersweet. The mother lynx had made her decision, and Annie knew it was for the best. She understood that wild animals, no matter how much they may seem to bond with those who care for them, ultimately have a stronger connection to their natural instincts than to human hands. The kittens were thriving, each of them growing stronger with each passing day. Their coats were thickening, their eyes were now wide open, and they had begun to explore the world around them. Annie couldn't help but smile as she watched them play, their tiny paws swatting at leaves and chasing the occasional insect. They were still too young to truly understand the wild, but they were learning, and that was all they needed for now. One morning, Dr. Rodriguez called Annie into his office. "I've been thinking about the next steps for the kittens," he said, his voice thoughtful. "They're nearing the point where they'll need to be released back into the wild. The question is when and how." Annie listened intently. "I know they need to be returned to their natural habitat, but it's a little scary to think about sending them back out there without their mother. Do you think they'll be ready?" Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "They're young, yes, but they're resilient. We'll start by slowly reintroducing them to the wild in stages. We can begin with acclimating them to the outdoors, letting them get used to the sounds and smells of their natural environment. Then, when the time is right, we'll give them the space they need to learn on their own." Annie had seen the wild instinct in the kittens, even in their playful antics. There was a certain wildness in their eyes, an unspoken knowledge that they were part of something larger, something beyond the safe confines of the center. But despite her understanding, a small part of her worried about letting them go. She had grown so attached to them, just as she had with the mother. "I know it's the right thing to do," she said softly, "but it still feels hard." "It always does," Dr. Rodriguez said, giving her a reassuring smile. "But you've given them the best possible start. They'll be okay." The plan for the kittens' release was set into motion. Over the next few weeks, the team worked to prepare a suitable location in the wild where the kittens could be released. It was a forested area, a perfect blend of dense woods and open clearings, with enough resources to help them survive on their own. The kittens would be released into this area, far from human settlements, where they could learn to hunt, climb, and live as wild lynx should. The day of the release arrived faster than Annie had anticipated. The morning was crisp, with the smell of pine in the air and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Annie stood at the edge of the forest, her heart pounding as she watched the kittens, now more than ready to take their first steps into the wild. The staff had gathered, and Dr. Rodriguez was there as well, overseeing the operation. The kittens had been transported in secure carriers, their eyes wide with curiosity as they peered out at the world beyond the bars. Annie opened the first carrier, and the smallest kitten, Luna, emerged. She blinked in the sunlight, pausing for a moment before stepping cautiously onto the earth. Her paws touched the ground with a soft thud, and she looked up at Annie, her eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and wonder. Luna took a few tentative steps forward, her fur rustling in the wind. The second kitten followed, a little bolder, sniffing the air and stretching his tiny body. He was quickly followed by the third, the most energetic of the three, who immediately darted toward a low-hanging branch, his instincts kicking in as he tested his climbing skills. Annie stood back, watching with a mixture of pride and sadness. She had done everything she could for them. The rest was up to them now. Dr. Rodriguez stood beside her, his voice gentle as he spoke. "You've done a great job, Annie. They're ready." Luna, the smallest, was the first to disappear into the underbrush, followed closely by the other two. For a few moments, they hesitated, looking back toward Annie as though they were unsure of what to do next. Then, without another glance, they turned and bounded into the wild, their tiny forms disappearing into the forest. Annie's heart swelled as she stood there, watching the last of the kittens vanish from view. She felt a deep sense of loss, but also an overwhelming sense of hope. They were no longer her responsibility. They were their own now, part of the untamed world they had been born into. The wind picked up, and Annie closed her eyes for a moment, letting the forest embrace her. She could hear the soft calls of the kittens in the distance, now fully part of the wild, calling to one another in their new home. "They'll be okay," Annie whispered to herself, more for reassurance than anything else. Dr. Rodriguez placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're not just okay. They're exactly where they belong." Months had passed since the kittens' release, and life at the Wildlife Center had gradually returned to its usual rhythm. Spring had come, bringing with it a renewed sense of life. The trees had regained their vibrant green, and the air was filled with the songs of birds and the rustling of leaves. But for Annie, there was always a quiet corner of her heart that missed the playful scurrying of the lynx kittens. One morning, Annie was out in the field, checking on some of the other animals that were being rehabilitated. It was a quiet day, the kind where everything seemed peaceful and still. As she made her way through the center's grounds, a rustling sound caught her attention. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a soft, tentative movement. She froze, her breath catching in her chest. The sound was unmistakable. Could it be? She whispered to herself, a rush of excitement sweeping through her. Annie crept slowly toward the noise, her eyes scanning the area. And there, in the tall grass near the edge of the forest, she saw them. 3 lynx kittens, no longer small and helpless, but sleek, agile, and full of life. They were just as she remembered, with the same playful energy in their movements. The smallest, Luna, was perched on a log, watching the others with curiosity as they explored their surroundings. The kittens were no longer the fragile little creatures she had raised, but instead were healthy, strong, and wild. They were thriving. A sense of pride welled up inside Annie as she took in the sight. Carefully, she crouched down behind a cluster of shrubs, hoping not to startle them. She could hardly believe her eyes. The kittens, her kittens, were back, and they were living the life they were meant to. Over the next few days, Annie spotted them several more times. They were often together, hunting small game, climbing trees, and practicing their natural instincts. They were independent now, no longer needing the shelter of the center. It was a bittersweet joy to see them like this, but Annie knew it was right. They were wild, and this was their home. As the weeks passed, the kittens gradually became more and more elusive. Annie would see their tracks in the dirt or catch a glimpse of them in the distance, but they had fully embraced their wild nature. They were becoming part of the forest, just as their mother had once been. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Annie stood by the forest's edge, watching the sky turn a brilliant shade of pink and gold. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a deep, knowing quiet that came from understanding that she had done her part. The kittens were free, the circle was complete. Suddenly, a sound behind her caught her attention. She turned and found Dr. Rodriguez standing there, a slight smile on his face. "You've been out here for a while," he said, his voice gentle. "Everything all right?" Annie nodded, her gaze still fixed on the forest. I wanted to see them one last time," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I think they're going to be okay." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, a proud gleam in his eyes. "They are. You gave them everything they needed to survive. Now they've made it on their own." For a long while, neither of them spoke. They simply stood in the fading light, watching the world around them. The forest was alive, and it was exactly where the lynx belonged. "I think I'll miss them," Annie said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Dr. Rodriguez said, his tone warm with understanding. "But this is the way of things. You gave them a chance. Now they're part of the world they were meant for." Annie smiled, though her heart still held a soft ache. She could never forget the little lynx family she had helped to raise, but she also knew that this was the greatest gift she could have given them. The opportunity to live as they were meant to live. As the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Annie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had come before. She had learned so much from the lynx, about resilience, freedom, and the delicate balance between care and independence. She had found her place in the world, and it was here, at the center, where she could continue to help and protect the wild creatures who needed her. And in a way, the lynx had helped her too. They had reminded her of the importance of letting go, of trusting the wild to take its course, and of knowing when to step back and allow nature to flourish on its own. With one last look at the forest, Annie turned and walked back to the center, her heart light with the knowledge that the lynx were out there, living their lives just as they should.